to the Napoleonic Wars pod and an episode that is going to please the inner reenactor, or frankly, the outer reenactor in Liam. We return to talk about guns, very specifically about gun making and the development of guns. And we have a fantastic guest making their Napoleonic Wars pod debut today. Peter Smithurst is Curator Emeritus of Historical Firearms at the Royal Armouries. Peter first joined the Armouries in 1994, actually, at Fort Nelson, and then moved to Leeds later in that year to help install new displays. He then went on to work at the American Precision Museum in Windsor, Vermont, returning to the Armouries in 2002 as curator of firearms before retiring in 2009, and continues to be very active within the museum, but has also written a very interesting book for Pen and Sword. Details are going to be in the descriptor, folks. Peter, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
Pleasure. It's an honor to be here.
So we're going to dive straight in and in an unimaginative fashion, start at the not quite beginning, the sort of beginning, in the sense of everybody who knows about this period probably thinks of two principal firearms. Of course, the Baker rifle and the musket of varying descriptions, whether it's the Charleville, whether it's the Tower. Obviously, people kind of conflating the Brown Bess with different patterns of musket and all the rest of it. But I want to kind of talk about how we get to the musket, because it's not an immediate and necessarily sort of linear transition from matchlock through to what we think of as the musket. So just talk us through where this concept of something like the musket comes from.
Well, if you go back to the early 15th century, handguns tended to be basically a wrought iron tube with a wrought iron extension on the rear end. And they had a vent hole at the top of the barrel. The problem with those was that when you loaded them, you had to delicately put a pile of gunpowder on top of the vent and then ignite it with a burning match fuse. Now, if it was raining or if the wind was blowing, the priming powder which sat on the vent was spoiled or blown away. The other problem was aiming it. The extension on the back of the barrel, often known as a tiller, was tucked under the left arm. The barrel was held in the left hand. And there was no way you could properly aim it at anything. But later in the 15th century, they developed the concept of a musket fitted with a stock. And once you had a barrel embedded in a wooden stock, it was much easier to use, it was much easier to aim, but it still suffered from that same problem of having a vent at the top of the barrel. And eventually somebody had the bright idea of moving that round to the side, attaching a small pan to the side of the barrel and filling that with powder. But again, it had to be ignited with a burning piece of match cord. And it was still at risk of rain or wind blowing it out. And that continued through with the mechanization of that firing process in terms of the matchlock, having an artificial hand on the gun itself, which held the match fuse. They devised a pan which had a cover which could be hinged over the powder until it was ready for use, and then hinged back to expose the powder for the match cord. It was still a flimsy sort of procedure. The next in line was the wheel lock, and there it basically involved the property of a piece of iron parites to create a spark when struck against a piece of steel. The problem with the wheel lock, it was a complicated mechanism, it was expensive to produce, and it found very little use in military terms because of that cost. From the wheel lock, we moved to the flintlock, which embodies a very similar principle of striking a spark by striking flint against steel. And again, once that had been adopted, it was a much easier lock system to make. It was cheaper. And gradually, by the end of the 17th century, it had become the standard firing mechanism for firearms.
So, thinking by the time we get into the 18th century, how well refined is the technology around gun making and gun manufacture?
At the beginning of the 18th century, uh, Reaumur, who was one of the French savants, wrote a textbook on iron and its manufacture. Uh, and in that book, he commented on the idealized uh, notion of having things interchangeable. Now, for those not familiar with interchangeability, it basically means making mechanisms, identical mechanisms, where each component was identical, not in terms of just form and appearance, but in terms of size. So you could take a piece from one mechanism and transplant it into an identical mechanism without any need for adjustment or filing or what have you. In 1722, this idea was put to the test, and a gunmaker named Guillaume made something like 630 gun locks that were all adjudged to be interchangeable. But they were also very expensive to produce, again, which didn't suit the military aspect. It involved a lot of extensive hand filing work and so on. And so the pursuit of interchangeability really got shelved at that time. It was reintroduced later in the 18th century, mainly by a gunmaker called Honoré Blanc, who was working under General Gribeval. Gribeval's main aim was to standardize French military weapons and equipment, and that extended to small arms as well as artillery. Blanc was given the job of pursuing that in terms of small arms. And through various muskets, he eventually came up with the model 1777, which is probably the most iconic of French military firearms. In 1763, he'd evolved a musket, which I think that was the one that was the first to have the barrel fitted to the stock with iron bands wrapped around both, rather than lugs welded onto the underneath of the barrel and cross pins passed through. And so that step alone set the 1777 musket apart from all the others, and certainly apart from what the British had at that time. He also devised means of making his components to a standard size. He built a set of gauges that were used to check the sizes of all the components, and that set of gauges still survives in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris. It was really the groundbreaking step in that process of the evolution of gun making from being a handcraft skill to becoming an engineered product in a way.
There's so much temptation to dive off in varying directions with this. You're talking there about sort of industrial processes. And I think it's important for our listeners to get a sense of just how much of a limitation the industrial requirements for good firearm creation put on design as much as anything else. We are talking about the era of the Industrial Revolution, broadly speaking, sort of 1750 through to 1900. So we're in that first sort of third, really, of the Industrial Revolution's development. And I'm
Yeah.
curious about how much the gun making industry itself changes alongside the development of the industrial processes. And inevitably, how does it cope with the increased demand that comes with the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, the American Revolution, and so on? Because I have a vision of sort of individuals in a little workshop, sort of maybe, he's got a couple of apprentices helping him out, very small scale, almost cottage industry styles of weapon production. But when you look at the number of muskets that varying nations need during this period, you can't do that and you can't scale it. So, how do these problems get overcome?
I think you've hit upon a very important point there. If you imagine the gun trade in Britain, in Birmingham, basically, there were literally dozens of specialized craftsmen. In some respects, it's a perfect reflection of Adam Smith's notion in terms of division of labor. So you can have a gun maker in a high street in some small town somewhere who made a complete gun. Once you come to require hundreds and thousands of them, that becomes the time to split it down into its component parts. And individual craftsmen would have found that they were better at doing one thing than another. So you ended up, as I say, with dozens of specialized craftsmen. You'd have not just people making locks, you'd have individual craftsmen making the different components of a lock. You'd have barrel makers, you'd have barrel welders, you'd have barrel borers, barrel finishers, and so on and so on. Now, if you take 18th century France, from what we can gather from sources like Diderot, Hermann Coty, the business of gun making was very much a handcraft industry, even on a large scale, as it was in Britain. At the same time, by the early 19th century, Russia had basically adopted the French 1770 musket as its regulation musket, which became the 1808 Russian musket. They were identical in nearly every way. But also we find in Russia at that time, in the weapon factory at Tula, more machines were being developed to take over some of these handcrafts. And thinking about it in a wider sense, you had to devise a machine that replicated the handcraft skills of the craftsman. And that could impose serious challenges, but they were able to overcome it. In 1782, I think it was, Tula sent some of its two of its gun makers to Britain to study gun making practice. One was working with Durr's Egg, and the other was working with Henry Knock. Now, these were the two, probably the foremost English gun makers at that time. A recent study by Professor Dave Williams and his co-authors have shown that Henry Knock was achieving interchangeability in his well-known screwless lock. So the guy who was working with Henry Knock was there at a time that Knock was developing that process. And it brings to mind quite a number of questions. The book produced about the factory at Tula in 1826 contains numerous engravings of the various machines used. So the question is, were those machines based on what this man had learned from Henry Knock and the machines that Henry Knock was using? The other factor is that in 1817, the Tula factory employed a man called John Jones and his son from the Birmingham trade. Now, Jones, whether father or son, was a die sinker, i.e., he made dies for forging items. The writer of the report on the Tula weapon factory, Joseph Gammel, comments on the fact that Jones revolutionized gun lock making at Tula. So, did Jones introduce die stamping for making the lock components at Tula? How far did Henry Knock unconsciously contribute to mechanization at Tula? And if you compare the sophistication of some of the machines at Tula with those used in the early American gun making industry, they are quite a way ahead. So you have this transition from handcraft to basically a mechanized industry, involving tremendous ingenuity in transferring or building those handcraft skills into a machine that can replicate them.
I think it's fascinating to look at the civilian contribution to sort of military technology. And when you look at that transference of knowledge internationally, at times when when it might not necessarily be at war, but there is clearly tension and a drive to outdo each other almost. You look at the way that we've spoken about on the podcast before. Military sort of attaches attend different drill sessions and things like that, and sort of learn and pick up. I'm interested to talk about we've got the industrial challenges on one hand, and particularly in war, there's nothing like a good war to push innovation in amongst military technology. And how were these the industrial challenges influencing, or the sort of need to outdo each other, as it were, influencing the various gun making designs? I think it's for a layman, it's quite easy to look at the various long barreled firearms of the period, or even short barreled weapons of the period, and sort of go, well, it's a wooden stock, it's a metal barrel, and it's a flint lock. It's almost like an Acme design, as it were. So how are these industrial challenges influencing the design across the world?
I'm not sure they had a great influence in the 18th century. We begin to see the development of breech loading firearms, but again, they were relatively crude. I mean, they were ingenious, but crude, because they still relied on using a lead ball loose powder fitted into the breech of a gun, and then somehow the breech closed. We know that Henry VIII had breech loading matchlocks, wheel locks, for instance, which used a steel chamber in place of a brass cartridge. It had a steel chamber which was loaded with powder and ball, fitted into the breech closed, but it was still fired by the wheel lock mechanism. And they were not terribly reliable. Some years ago, I was asked by Royal Armouries to make a replica of one of Henry VIII's shield guns. Bearing in mind, I was able to use fairly modern technology to produce it. It still took a long time, but it also begs the question of how long it would have taken to make one at the time in question. It was breech loading. It had a steel chamber which was inserted into the breech. Making that today was quite a challenge. Making it in the 16th century would have been a far bigger challenge. And the breech was closed by just basically a steel stirrup folding over the back of the inserted chamber. So technology was tinkering with developing along the lines of breech loading, but it never really got very far. If you think about the Baker rifle, which the Sharp TV series has probably made extremely well known, it was good, it was accurate, but the barrel fouled after several shots and made it so difficult to load that riflemen were issued with a mallet to drive the ramrod and the ball down. So it was only issued to a few special troops. It was never a universal issue to all infantry. And it's not until basically probably the middle of the 19th century when you see gun-making technology being adapted and adopted to make other things. But I mean, that is a whole new story in itself. I started writing something years ago, and it was called Gun Making by Machinery, Birth of the Consumer Society. And I think, you can make that direct link, but it's possibly out of place to talk about it in terms of the Napoleonic Wars.
I was very interested when you were describing this process of sort of there'll be individuals who make specific parts of a lock, or there'll be individuals who specialize in bringing those parts together into the much wider sort of lock mechanism, and so on. That you've got all of these individuals. Are they in sort of adjacent workshops? Is there any kind of it doesn't seem like much of a leap to us to think, well, you give each of these people a bench within a shed, and then person X does the first part, and then they pass the weapon over, and so you have effectively the production line of sort of Henry Ford fame. But because everybody talks about Ford being the guy who creates the early production line, I'm very reluctant to say, but surely that's what they were doing, because history teaches us, no, it's Ford who comes up with it. Is there any sense of, look, we're going to work collaboratively on this, and I've done my part, there you go, you carry on and do your bit? Is there, because there is this compartmentalization, is there therefore this flow that goes through a kind of wider workshop in a quasi factory setting, or is that me just kind of trying to read too much into the process?
I think I can give you two examples, really. In the cutlery trade in Sheffield, for instance, you had specialist penknife blade forgers, pocket knife blade forgers, table knife blade forgers, butcher knife blade forgers, and so on. These mostly worked in individual workshops in their back gardens. The same was true in gun making. Henry Knock, for instance, he had several people on his payroll, but he also hired several people who were not paid members of staff, as it were. They were outworkers, they were independent craftsmen. And they were used to create the components of the lock. And there was one person in Henry Knock's workshop who used these components to assemble the final lock. You get the same in the Sheffield industry with the cutlery trade. You have, say, individual blade forgers, you have individual blade grinders. After they'd done their job, the item was passed to the cutler, who converted it into a finished product, much like Henry Knock assembling components of a gun lock. So it was a production line in a way, but not all under one roof. Yeah.
And following on from that, if I may, Peter, I'm thinking of the example of Ezekiel Baker. Now, I believe he was one of Knock's or apprentice to Knock at one point before opening his own shop in London. Now, is that going to be the same across the different firearms? And I guess we could even open that even wider to different nations. Are they all producing guns in a similar fashion? And particularly with something like the Baker, which at the time is more technical because of the rifling and such like that. I actually drive past Ezekiel Baker's shop in Whitechapel quite often at work. And I've often thought, is that almost the sort of headquarters where things like sales and, the kind of the front of house, and how sort of far away are all of these parts coming from to come together to create a finished Baker?
I think most of them would have been made quite likely in Birmingham. There were a number of craftsmen in London, but even at that time, the trade had begun to concentrate in Birmingham. So Baker, like Knock, might have employed several workmen directly, but he also would have relied on outworkers. And I think in terms of military firearms in general, the musket as opposed to the rifle, the way things worked in Britain was that the Tower would offer contracts to barrel makers in Birmingham, to lock makers, furniture makers. When I say furniture, I mean gun furniture, the lock plate, the butt plate, the trigger guard, and so on. They were all made and then brought to the Tower. And they were issued from the Tower to craftsmen called setters up. They were the guys who made the stock and fitted all the components together to make the completed weapon. So again, you have this production line notice, but it's not all under one roof. It's created on separate workshops, brought together at the Tower, then dispersed again to separate workshops, and then comes back to the Tower. And I'm sure the French and Russian military manufacturing would have operated on very similar lines. In fact, Gamel, in his book on Tula, speaks of the lock makers working from home.
So you've got your setters up who are putting these weapons together, and you mentioned that that's sort of similar across the nations at the time. Just to sort of round off and finish the process, how does it go from that setters up hands into the hands of a soldier at the front?
Well, once the completed musket had been returned to the tower, it was from there that they will be distributed to the individual regiments. I don't think there was anything particularly special about that procedure. It was basically standard practice.
Okay. I'm gonna sort of delve into the nerdery of ammunition caliber at this
Right.
point.
Okay.
There is I don't know if it's a myth. It's something that I've heard repeated a fair few times about the difference between the calibers of French and British muskets. Now, the thing that I understand to be correct within this is the French caliber ball was a little bit smaller. Where the myth potentially comes in is that this therefore may have meant that the British could have used French ammunition if they were absolutely desperate, because it would actually fit down the bore of the barrel. Now, firstly, is that a myth? Do we have any indication of the British kind of going, look, we just can't get a supply of the relevant style, the relevant size lead balls, so we're going to use this French ammunition that we've captured? But also, I'm curious about the implications of using this. When you have a bullet that is the wrong caliber, what does that do in terms of the effect on things like muzzle velocity, range, accuracy, and all the rest of it?
Right. Firstly, the standard caliber for a French musket was 17.5 millimeters. The British New Land pattern musket, for instance, caliber was 3/4 of an inch, which is 19 millimeters basically. So the French musket ball was smaller by 1.5 millimeters on the diameter, and so 0.75 millimeters on radius. So it could be fired out of a brown bess. The problem with any musket, not just whether they're using French balls in a British musket or whatever, is that the musket ball was a relatively loose fit to allow it to be loaded easily. At the moment of explosion, you would have the gases from the explosion passing the side of the ball. So that energy was wasted in effect. If you'd wrap that ball in a bit of paper to make it a tighter fit, but not too tight a fit, and rammed it home and fired it, there would have been no gas escape. So the ball would have traveled much faster. And range is basically a function of muzzle velocity. So the faster a ball leaves the muzzle, the farther it will go. Interestingly, in the 1780s, Charles Hutton, who was professor of mathematics at the Woolwich Academy, did a couple of very interesting experiments using a perfectly bored, straight musket barrel fitted with a standard ball. It was fired at a target 700 yards away. It missed the target by 100 yards either side. I mean, that is incredible inaccuracy. I mean, it was later said in the 19th century if you're firing a smoothbore musket at a church door, aim at the weathercock, which really sums it up. He also experimented with a slightly bent musket barrel. So this barrel was bent to the right. When it was fired, the ball was forced to follow the left-hand wall of the barrel, and it was in effect rolling along. So as it left the muzzle, it was spinning on a vertical axis. This ball was shown to veer off to the right and then suddenly turn and veer off to the left. Yeah, these are things that are never really considered in musketry at all. But the basic fact is a musket ball going down a barrel ricochets from side to side, whether it's up and down or side to side. So its eventual direction of flight will depending on what was the last thing it hit before it left the muzzle. Does that answer the question?
It does. Sorry, Liam and I are both sort of sitting here, kind of quietly going, "Okay, we really want to rabbit hole this," because I hadn't considered it, but yeah, it's so for folks who aren't kind of working out kind of how this works. Think about the spin on a snooker ball. For
Yeah.
example, when you put backspin, for example, yes, your initial impetus will send it in a particular direction, but once the spin takes hold, it goes in an entirely different
Yes.
trajectory.
Yeah.
And I'd never considered that actually. Obviously, I'd kind of, and my follow-up question was going to be about sort of imperfections with barrels and things like wastage and longevity and all the rest of it. But actually, as you say, it's kind of rattling around on its way out,
Yeah.
which has all kinds of implications. That's interesting. This is more a question for Liam perhaps than anybody. All right, Liam. Yeah, you take the mic.
Well, I was just gonna. There must be scientifically, at least, and this is a terrible thing to assume, but the muzzle velocity on, say, any given 100 standard made, say, Charlevilles or brown Besses, the muzzle velocity will obviously depend on the quality and amount of powder
Yeah.
that's been put in. But if you were to, do those measurements pretty exactly, the muzzle velocity will be the same. It'll be the direction that the ball travels that will be different. Is that correct?
Yes.
Mm.
Yeah.
And there must then come a point where, for instance, how do I get this out? I'm sort of working through it in my mind. If whatever the set number for the muzzle velocity is, how long in terms of distance would it take for that windage to have an effect on a ball? If you're firing at, say, 20 yards, the grouping, I imagine, will be smaller. The greater the distance, the larger the grouping.
Yeah, once the ball or the bullet leaves the muzzle, it begins to slow down because the driving force is no longer there. It's dissipated. So if, for instance, you fire a gun, any sort of gun, with the barrel perfectly horizontal, as soon as the ball when it leaves the muzzle, it will begin to drop due to gravity. So to get the extra range, you have to elevate the barrel. And theoretically, best elevation for maximum range is at 45 degrees, although it does vary. And the amount of powder is to some extent governed by partly by the length of the barrel, for instance, and the strength of the barrel. If you put too much powder in, you could either burst the barrel or because the powder is ignited from the rear, it blows the powder forward, and often you find unburnt powder exiting the muzzle. So there is that optimum amount of powder to get, well, to make sure all the powder is burnt, all the energy has been applied to the projectile, just at the point that it leaves the muzzle.
And staying with that question about quality of barrels, quality of muskets, how obviously there's a need for a degree of standardization, but you don't have a modern day sort of inspectorate kind of department that can go around and do sort of stress tests on these things and all the rest of it to make sure the batch is up to standard. So how much variation is there? Is that even a question that we can answer? Is this something where sort of 3 barrels in 10 probably just had to be melted down again because the process of creation was flawed, or is that
Well,
something that's beyond us?
I can only basically refer to British practice at that time. A gun barrel had to go through proof. So usually it was loaded with a slightly extra charge of powder and possibly two musket balls and fired. If it survived that, it could survive firing the standard charge of powder and a single musket ball. Barrels that passed proof, well, they were first inspected visually to see there were no nasty features inside the bore or on the outside that were going to weaken it. And it would be stamped with the view mark, crown over V, and the inspector's number or initial. After proof, it will be stamped with a proof mark, crown over P, etc., etc. With regard to the quality of the materials, there was no real metallurgical testing available at that time. But metal workers could often, and did quite often, make very correct judgments on the quality of a piece of wrought iron, say. And in Britain, for barrel making, the best wrought iron came from the Midlands. Later, when they started adopting steel barrels, but I mean, there we're talking at the 1860s, Thomas Firth of Sheffield, well-known steel makers, they supplied a lot of steel to Enfield, both for bayonets and barrels and what have you. So there was a form of inspection of material quality, but it was never scientific in the sense that we understand it today.
It is absolutely fascinating. I could honestly rabbit hole this gun making and design process all day. I do want to move us on to a slightly different topic, being the ignition system, as it were. And we certainly see the implementation of percussion caps in the 18th and early 19th century, particularly for pistols. You often see dueling pistols from the period that were percussion caps. I just wonder if you could talk us through the development of percussion caps and how that sort of changed the gun making game moving into the 19th century.
Yeah, the percussion system basically got off the ground with the Reverend Forsyth's patent of 1807. And he used a fulminating mixture which consisted of basically potassium chlorate and possibly red phosphorus or sulfur. Now, if you mix those items intimately together and strike them with a hammer, they detonate. The problem was it had no safe means of applying that, or no simple safe means of applying that principle to a firearm. He came up with what is referred to as a scent bottle lock. And basically it involved a spigot being screwed into the breech of a gun, the scent bottle, which was a container, urn shape, basically, which pivoted on this spigot. And that was filled with a fulminating compound. The spigot itself contained a hole communicating with the breech of the gun in which the powder was contained. As rotated the scent bottle, which was the reservoir of fulminate, some would drop into the cavity in the spigot. Turning it right round would bring into position a pin, which could be struck by a hammer, would detonate the fulminate in the cavity in the spigot and fire the gun. It was fraught with difficulty and danger, and it was expensive to produce. So it never really got off the ground. Joseph Manton tried to improve it by inventing what he called a tube lock, which was basically a small piece of fine bored copper tube filled with fulminate mixture, sealed off at each end, inserted into a hole in a fixture on the lock, and then again hit with a hammer. And that detonated and blasted its way through into the chamber of the gun. But again, it was an expensive modification to any guns. So found rare use in sporting circles and had no chance in terms of military weapon technology. The cap itself, which we've come to know, was invented by Joshua Shaw in America in 1821. And as we all know, it basically took the form of a copper top hat, if you like, a miniature top hat. In the crown of that was some fulminate mixture held in place with a spot of varnish. That was fitted on a nipple screwed into the breech of the gun and then struck by a hammer. It was so simple, it couldn't have been simpler. And that single thing revolutionized firearms technology.
It's remarkable sometimes, isn't it? How sort of the simple, well, I suppose it's not remarkable because with a firearm, you need it to be simple so that it's functional.
Yeah.
But we're talking about all of these developments in the development of what are fundamentally small arms. Is there discussion between sort of effectively the left and the right hand of military operations in that do gun makers turn around to those producing artillery pieces and say, well, I'll tell you what, we're experimenting with this. Do they have those conversations or do they sort of exist within their own separate spheres?
I'm sure they didn't, mainly because there's a vast difference between a small arm and an artillery piece. At the time in question, artillery barrels were either made of cast iron or cast bronze. It seems intuitive to make a gun bigger and fire further. You need to put more powder in, perhaps make it a bigger bore, perhaps make the gun bigger. But there comes a point when no matter how big you've made the gun, how thick the walls of the bore are, it will burst. Benjamin Robbins in the 18th century explored this a bit, but didn't really get very far. Charles Hutton, who I mentioned earlier, explored it further. And by the 1830s, they come up with a theory which is known as the theory of circumferential tensions, which basically mathematically shows how in the wall of a cannon, the stresses imposed on the wall decline from inside the bore to the outside of the barrel, which is what we would expect. But it's also important to take into account the tensile strength of the barrel material, iron or bronze or later steel. And that's when they came up with the idea of having a tube within a tube within a tube built up shrink fit. So the first tube is compressed by the tube on its outside. That is all compressed by a third tube on its outside. And that increases the strength of the barrel and allows greater power to be developed, and therefore greater range or greater hitting power.
Now you talk about range there, and I know we touched on it slightly earlier in various guises with Baker and the rifle and sort of various military rifles of the period. But how is rifling developed, and why does it seem to have such an uncertain start in its military capacity? You know, rifle barrels aren't a new thing in the 18th century. But it seems to be a very sort of chalk and cheese thing to have, you know, the sort of trope that Napoleon hated rifle barrels and all that sort of caper. It seems to have a real sort of hit and miss relationship with the military. I wonder if you could explain that.
I think part of it lies in the fact that using a muzzle loading rifle requires a lot of training of the troops. Training soldiers to use a flintlock musket, firing a brass ball through a smooth bore barrel, is relatively straightforward. Training someone to use a rifle, which requires a lot of care in the loading of it. I mean, using an iron rammer down an iron barrel is, you know, to some extent asking for trouble because you're going to damage the rifling at some point. Also, the grooves of the rifling act as perfect traps for the solid residues from burning powder. And as that accumulated, it made loading more and more difficult. The ball needed to engage with the rifling grooves, otherwise it was pointless having a rifle. So it was wrapped usually in a linen patch. It was also lubricated with tallow or some other sort of animal fat. The idea of the tallow was not to lubricate the ball coming out of the barrel. It was to leave a film of lubricant on the bore of the barrel to help reduce fouling. Now, as the barrel fouled, it required more and more force to get the ball down the barrel. And as I said earlier, the rifle brigade, using the Baker, were issued with wooden mallets to drive the ramrod and the ball down the barrel. And the bullet had to sit firmly on top of the powder. If there was a gap between the powder and the base of the bullet, the chances are the barrel would burst. So it it was both a risky process, but also an exhausting one. If we can sort of just jump forward a bit to the 19th century with the Brunswick rifle, which was introduced from Germany in the 1830s, that used two-groove rifling. It fired a spherical ball with basically a belt around it. Looked like a model of Saturn with a compressed ring. It was suffered from the same problem of the Baker, and a comment was made that the use of the Brunswick was such hard work that the commentator wondered how the rifleman had the strength to hold it steady after firing a few rounds. So they were problems that enveloped the rifle at that time.
I want to spend a little bit of time talking about your experience as a curator, if we may. You've worked
Mm.
for the Royal Armouries. You, within that role, no doubt have to work with colleagues on the preservation of these firearms. So give us a sense of what that preservation process involves and also how far you go with that process in terms of keeping these firearms sort of in a good working order versus perhaps preserving the aging of that firearm and the value that you can gain in some instances of saying, well, look, this is what happens to this firearm over time, and this is part of this weapon's history.
Yeah, yeah. There, I think in the wider world, there's a conflict between conservation and restoration. Um, Museums generally opt for the conservation approach because damage to any piece of arms and armor is seen as part of its history. To give an instance, we have in our collections a French musket whose barrel burst on the battlefield at Waterloo. So the wood is fragmented, the barrel is rusty, but it tells its own story in that condition. And so it's preserved in that condition. When it comes to mechanisms, i.e. lock mechanisms and breech mechanisms, we have had arguments in the past between curators and the conservators as to whether to use oil or not. From my perspective as a curator, I would argue that you don't have a beautiful clock and never oil it, because otherwise it ceases to function. And it's the same with having a gun lock or a gun breech mechanism, which needs to be operated quite often to show how it functions. But if it's never lubricated, that operation becomes harder and harder and risks damage to the weapon itself. So I'm all in favor of conservation, but there are times, I think, when a more pragmatic approach needs to be adopted.
Yeah, I feel that argument very strongly. The one that I always ever so slightly struggle with is instruments, because yes, it is absolutely vital to preserve these so that we can study them and understand them. But at the same time, the function of an
Yeah,
instrument is for it to be played. And by depriving the instrument of that opportunity in order to save it for future generations, you also deprive it of its raison d'etre and its voice. And I
yeah,
often feel that that's very sad in a lot of ways. But equally, if you've
yeah,
got an original Stradivarius, you don't want to be handing that out to an idiot like me who's just going to absolutely butcher a
yeah,
concerto in it. Do you know what I mean?
yeah.
And I guess it's a similar kind of
I
tension that
think
you have
I
to
think
face.
there is, yes, yeah. I mean, we're very fortunate in Royal Armouries insofar as our licensing from the Home Office allows us to not only have a collection which contains otherwise prohibited weapons, but also to be able to fire them on occasions. So we have a separate collection of firearms that are acquired and designating for demonstration firing. And obviously, when they've been used, I mean, for instance, a French musket or an English musket or whatever, fired with black powder, you have to swab the barrel out with hot water. You know, I mean, from a conservation point of view, that would be an absolute nightmare. But from a conservation of a fired weapon, it's vital. Otherwise, it's going to corrode away.
I mean, I think the question I would love to ask next is, as someone who owns and operates reproduction flintlock firearms from the period, is how do I get into Leeds Armories and get my hands on some of these pieces to have a look and a play? And I mean, I'm sure you talk about the preservation process. There's a preserver just probably collapsed with a heart attack in that moment, letting the thought of letting me. I mean, I grew up in a military family, and my interest in firearms runs very deep.
Mm.
But while we've got an expert on firearms of the period, I wonder if I can put you on the spot, if it is even possible to put you on the spot, Peter, and talk about which is the best long-barreled weapon, whether that be the best, the Charleville, the Russian, the Prussian, which is the best, and can we even answer that when there are so many parameters in terms of powder quality, quality of training? Is it a question we can answer?
I'm not sure it is, but I'll have a go. Uh, if you take it from the design point of view, and again, confining ourselves to the 18th century, the French 1777 has to stand out because it influenced so many other weapon designs after it appeared. I mean, we've talked about how the Russians copied it in its entirety. It also influenced the design of weapons, muskets used by other European countries and America. So I think the design continues to this day, or aspects of it continue, perhaps not to this day, but until recently. When you look at things like the SMLE rifle, that had bands holding the barrel to the stock. That was developed by Honoré Blanc for his 1763 musket and perfected in the 1777 musket. In terms of usage, I don't think there's a lot of difference between the muskets of that period. They're all basically the same system. Does that answer your question, or have I left something out?
No, I think that's perfect. I would just follow up and ask, in terms of maybe an aesthetic, which is your favorite?
A difficult question. I think the French 1777 of that period would have to be my favourite. Although the English Newland pattern would also be a strong contender.
Liam certainly approves of that second part of your answer. Peter, wow, what a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for giving us your time for this one. Folks, you need to go and buy Peter's book in order to dig much deeper into, because we frankly barely scratched the surface on all of this. So the evolution of gun making is available from Pen and Sword. As I'm always beseeching you, go direct to Pen and Sword rather than doing the predictable thing of going to Amazon and funding Jeff Bezos's missions to Mars or whatever the latest thing is that he thinks he's going to do now. Peter, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you again very soon.
My pleasure. Before you go, your colleague there raised the question of visiting Royal Armouries. If you care to contact me, Katie will give you my email address at home. I can arrange for you to go into stores and escort you.
And on that absolute cliffhanger, we will bring it to a close. Folks, you have been listening to the Napoleonic Wars pod. We will be back very soon. Merry Christmas, folks. If you'd like to spread the festive cheer this evening, you know what I'm about to say. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Normally, when you listen to these, please, you're likely to be on the commute, so can't act on them, especially if you're in the car. And then you perhaps promptly forget. But if you're tuning in over the break, there is a chance you could actually do it right now. It'll take you a few seconds. And if all of our listeners did it, we'd be one of the top-rated podcasts in Europe. If you've enjoyed the 80 episodes we've produced this year and the hundreds of hours of free entertainment we provide to you, this is your way of paying us back. Help us rebuild. Help us reach more people. Head to Apple Podcasts, leave a quick sentence and a 5-star score. I can't emphasize enough how much difference it makes to the algorithm. Looking for a present for the Napoleonicist in your life? We have a shop packed with Napoleonic Wars pod merch. Check out the link in the description. And did you know you can now gift people memberships to the Patreon perks we offer? So if you want to treat someone to our online course, exclusive Meet the Author sessions, socials, green room access to recordings, and exclusive episodes, head to patreon.com/NapWarsPod to find out more. Much love to all our Patreon supporters who are enjoying a rejuvenated and revitalized offering of perks on Patreon. As I say, head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out how you can join this buzzing community of like-minded Napoleonic nerds who are enjoying such a richer offering. Their support is empowering us to triple our output and keep you entertained with Napoleonic nerdery on a near daily basis. Prices start from just £2 a month, so if you can spare the cost of a cup of coffee each month to support us, it would mean a huge amount and might even fund some exciting documentary work. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-December 2024, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Stephen Colson, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Cotland, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findlay, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, Joe Ayres, and Dan Friedman. The Admirals: Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Woolcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin. The Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser. The Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham. And in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh, and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.